All right, so as promised, here's the full video for the David Dumbroff domestic violence interview. A lot of great tidbits in there. Thanks again, Dave. You're my first interview,
Well, I
right?
appreciate that.
Oh, we had Liliana, and she counts. I won't say she doesn't count because
No, she's the
she'll
best.
kill us. But you're the first real one, which is good because when I first started the show, I said you were coming by that day, and that never happened because, like I said in that particular episode, which Joanne heard yesterday, life happens, right? We make plans, and then God laughs. What are we gonna talk about? We talk about
Why don't we talk about
DUIs.
domestic violence?
Domestic violence. What is domestic violence?
So, domestic violence, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what happens in a typical domestic violence case.
Yeah.
So one party makes an allegation that another party has put them in fear of their safety. Typically, it's heard at the municipal court level, in front of a judge, on what's called an ex parte basis, meaning that somebody goes in, makes allegations and complaints about somebody else, and the other side is not even there to defend itself. Judges will routinely enter a temporary restraining order to err on the side of safety. And once the restraining order is entered, the temporary restraining order, that means that the police will then go to serve the restraining order. So in the normal scenario, they come to the person's house, they will have the person leave the house, they will give them 20 minutes to gather their clothes, their items, and they will not be able to return to the house. Oftentimes, sadly, it includes a restriction on the ability to have contact with your own children, family members, and that is a complete bar. And if you violate that, it then becomes a criminal charge. A domestic violence complaint is purely a civil case. So when an attorney gets involved in a case, the person's already been charged with an act of domestic violence, then there's several different types of allegations that can be made. For example, harassment is probably the one that I see the most. Person alleges that the other party used coarse language, offensive conduct, put the other person in fear of inappropriate touching. They go to the municipal court. Municipal court hears the case on an ex parte basis, and after they hear it, the judge will then make a determination as to whether or not a temporary restraining order is warranted. It's not always heard by municipal court. Oftentimes it's heard by the Superior Court, and in Sussex County, sometimes it's actually heard by a hearing officer who has been authorized to hear these types of cases. That person is not a judge, but they will hear these cases and they will make a recommendation to a Superior Court judge who will then determine whether or not to sign off on the order or the recommendation by the hearing officer.
What's the bar, right? It's like, what's the most minimum thing you have to do in order to get a restraining order put on you?
Well, it's really so fact sensitive. I've seen judges enter restraining orders for things that I find shocking. For example, a person says that the other person, used some type of language, called the person an offensive word. You would not think, in the normal circumstances, that would be enough to get a temporary restraining order. I've seen it where a judge will enter a temporary restraining order on a fairly innocuous occurrence. Where I typically see these cases is parties are getting divorced, and in order to get the upper hand in a divorce, the person will file a restraining order to have the spouse removed from the home. So when somebody comes in to see an attorney before a restraining order is entered, one of the things that I often counsel them is to start recording everything. You're not going to have a witness in the house all of the time, but you can have recordings. And I find that video and audio can be invaluable in helping to defend the allegations of a temporary restraining order. Because what happens after the temporary restraining order is entered, in very short order, you get a date for a final hearing. These are summary proceedings. Summary proceeding means that it's not a situation where discovery is permitted. So you have to go to that court with your witnesses, with your evidence, and be presented to, be ready to present your case. So what happens if a final restraining order gets entered? And then we'll sort of circle back in a moment. Final restraining order can be rather dramatic. There's a presumption that the person that receives a final restraining order should not be the custodial parent. You cannot have any weapons. So if you have a fire ID card, that will be surrendered. All weapons that you own, even if you're a hunter, those items will be taken by the sheriff's department from your home. You will be on a national registry. So if you travel outside the country and you come into the country, you may be flagged, and they may pull you into a separate room to find out what the situation is as to whether or not you should even be permitted into the country. Restraining orders in New Jersey, unlike restraining orders in other states, never end. So if a final restraining order is entered, it will be in place forever. And that's why it's so important to get an attorney to defend you when you receive a restraining order.
Now, you said forever, but if the other party wishes to take, if the other party is amenable to removing it, they will.
Absolutely. There's actually a whole body of case law that talks about situations where the restraining order is no longer being used as a shield, but as a weapon. So the person that has the restraining order against them is now invited over to the other party's home. They go to the home, and the party then calls the police, which would result typically in a violation of a final restraining order. But you can file an application on behalf of your client to have that restraining order dismissed if it's no longer viable. And again, it's being used as a sword rather than as a shield.
Yeah.
If you receive a final restraining order, you will attend anger management, any type of counseling that the court recommends. It will impact your parenting time. You may only be permitted to have supervised parenting time until the court determines that you're capable of having unsupervised parenting time. So again, I can't stress enough the importance of having an attorney in a domestic violence case.
So, but the key to domestic violence, right, is the restraining order. And a lot of people come in, they talk, well, I want to get a restraining order against so and so. I want to get a restraining order against my my neighbor. But you can't.
No, the restraining orders can only be issued if you meet certain statutory criteria. For example, you had a dating relationship, but there are exceptions to that. I've had situations where two people were in a fraternity together and they lived under the same roof. They would meet the statutory criteria of the basis for a restraining order. So you do have unusual circumstances. Now, the other side is somebody comes into your office and says, hey, I want to get a final restraining order. Up in Sussex, I often will refer that person over to Domestic Abuse Services, Inc., or as we refer to it as DAISY. I find that they have some excellent people over at that office, and they will help give guidance, because lots of times the restraining order, the temporary restraining order that was issued, doesn't have all of the detail in it that may be necessary in order to achieve a final restraining order. So you want to have that person go and really give a detailed history of the relationship, because I think that's important for a judge to understand why this event should not be looked in an isolated situation, but rather as a pattern of behavior. In fact, when somebody dismisses a restraining order, the court will require them to sign off on a certification that educates them that domestic violence is often a cycle of abuse, meaning that an abuse takes place, there's a period of time where there's reconciliation, or what they call the honeymoon period, and then it happens again. So in order to dismiss a restraining order, the court will actually require the person that wants to dismiss the restraining order to meet with counselors to make sure that they are educated about the implications of domestic violence. And even if they dismiss the restraining order, the court will, without reservation, say that the person should not feel any reluctance to return to court should there be another incident.
It's funny. I'm laughing, smiling because you're just like, it's like I opened an encyclopedia and it just started reading to me. Like, you know more stuff than you've forgotten more stuff than I know.
Well, you know, over the course of 33 years, I've seen all types of circumstances. I've seen people who have been removed from their parents' home so that the girlfriend now has occupancy of the home. I've seen every potential scenario I think that you can possibly imagine. And so what I was going to say about that is what's important for people to recognize is that when you go into a domestic violence court, it's a purely civil case. And so the standard is by what's called a preponderance of the evidence. Now we think of the TV shows, the I forget the name of that show.
Law and Order?
Law and Order. Those cases has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That is not the same in a domestic violence case. First of all, you're not in front of a jury, you're in front of a judge. And the standard for the judge is by a preponderance of the evidence. So if you were to think of the scales of justice, Lady Liberty holding the scales of justice, if you put enough evidence in to simply tip those scales, that is enough to establish your burden by a preponderance of the evidence. So again, it's important when you're prosecuting a case to make sure that you establish that burden. And naturally, when you're defending a case, you want to try to show that they did not establish that burden. Now, the overwhelming majority of cases that are brought in court typically result in what are called civil restraints. Civil restraints are really a great resolution where you take the case out of the domestic violence court and the parties enter into an agreement that says they won't have any contact with each other. There's all types of restrictions. And if you have children, you may be able to contact each other in non-harassing manner. I think that those are probably the best ways that is probably one of the best ways to resolve domestic violence cases, because you now have a written agreement. Everybody knows what their responsibilities are, and it doesn't have the same consequences that a final restraining order has. Should a person violate an agreement, you return to court and you file what is called a motion to enforce litigants' rights. And judges typically frown upon litigants who do not follow agreements.
Yeah, you've had some probably great stories. I know I had one where it was the mother and his son, and he was a grown man. But it's enough, right, that she, and again, we're talking to a guy in his 30s. It was enough that she grabbed his arm like that, right, and caused redness. That's enough to get a TRO, right?
Sure. Not only is that enough, but when the police report to the scene, their standard operating procedure, if they see any signs of injury, they must arrest the person that caused that injury. They don't have any discretion. They must arrest. So, yeah, I would say I've seen some unusual circumstances. What I think is the most common thread is that these are families that are typically in a lot of pain. There's a lot of emotions. And I think that's probably why law enforcement officers dread these types of situations, because they are so charged emotionally that people aren't often using their best judgment. And I would say that sometimes the outcome is not ideal.
They become not ideal. You're going to hear him say that a lot, because it won't be the last time on this channel. I mean, not only the cops, but we become counselors.
It's true. We go to law school, and the first thing I always say to my clients when they come in is, I'm no smarter than you are. I've gone to law school. I know the system, but I will listen to you. And I think that's the most important thing is for attorneys to give the client an opportunity to explain what happened, sort of get it off their chest, and remind them that them going to therapy is a very brave thing to address whatever the underlying issues are, and that in fact the court will not negatively look upon that. The court will often say the fact that the person has gone to therapy is evidence that they've taken this matter seriously, and that this was a one-time event, and that because of the fact that they've engaged in therapy, there isn't the likelihood that they will repeat this action.
I mean, is the stigma is it lifted already? Or do some people still think, oh my God, you're going to therapy?
No, I think the opposite. I think there's a recognition that when you go to therapy, it's a sign of, it's a brave person, it's a thoughtful person, and it's somebody who's willing to address their limitations.
Yeah. But at least it's something. And that mental aspect of what we're talking about is becoming more and more prevalent in terms of acceptance.
Sure.
In general, and especially among kids.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's important. When there's a domestic violence action and kids are present, I don't think, first of all, the parents don't really appreciate the impact that that's having on their children. And we model for our kids. So when kids see one party being physical with another, using inappropriate language, from their young person's perspective, they're assuming that this is the way to treat other people. And so at the end of the day, it's important that people recognize the long-term impacts of that type of behavior.
So let's go back to TROs, because I think a lot of people have questions about that we probably haven't even touched on. Joanne, how about you? You have any questions about TROs? About work. So if she has somebody at work that's bothering her, that counts, right? You can get a TRO against that person.
What are the sort of factors that involve that in a workplace?
Well, in order for it to happen at work, you still have to have a relationship. So the fact that you work with somebody, if you have a disagreement, your remedy, if it rises to the level, would be go to municipal court. I thought what you were going to get at is I've had plenty of people who are in a relationship who work together, and you can imagine that when there's a temporary restraining order, that person can no longer go to work. But if there's a problem between two coworkers, that's not something that's going to meet the statutory criteria for a temporary restraining order.
Really?
When you say relationship, are we talking like, is this specifically have to do also with like a sexual nature activity, or is this just any sort of like vague relationship, friendship?
The courts will call it a dating relationship.
Okay,
so
there has to be a romantic aspect involved.
It does.
In order for there to be a TRO in a workspace sort of
exactly. So it's a gender neutral analysis by the court. Right. They're not going to get into fine details. You don't have to live together. You can simply be going out to dinners together. But if it's a dating relationship, that should be enough, so long as you're over 18, to satisfy the elements of a domestic violence complaint.
Okay.
So, like I said, Joanne joined us yesterday. Literally yesterday. I said, yes, you're on board. So she's going to be handling a lot of the, what of all this?
It's a lot of information.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. And for you, it's like you just opened, it's like you just hit play. I said, Dave, tell me about domestic violence. And you just, boom, hit the play button and just started going.
Well, I think that when they teach us to become attorneys, they don't always teach us the practical realities of these types of situations, which is something that you're going to encounter certainly on a weekly basis. A lot of attorneys don't like to handle these types of cases. They're very emotionally charged, and they often result in trials. The goal is to try to resolve cases, try to avoid trials, and come up with sensible solutions.
What is a few pieces of advice that you would give to somebody going through a DV case of any kind or a TRO?
Well, the first thing I said, and would repeat, is always get an attorney, because the consequences are such a great magnitude. Number two is never ever reach out to the other side if there's a restraining order. I have had more situations, people will send the other person an anniversary card, flowers for a birthday. Those are all violations of a temporary restraining order. If you go into the supermarket, if you go into the ShopRite and you see the other person, you leave. If you're in Sparta and you go into TROs, you leave. You should not be in the other person's presence. The more common scenarios are you're at a child's ball game, kids playing football, stay on the other side of the field so nobody can make any allegations that there was any inappropriate contact.
So I got to share this one. I get my first pro bono case, right? It's a young couple. They're not married, but they have a child. And the mother of the mother, right? So baby mama's mama doesn't like baby daddy. So she convinces her to get a TRO on him. All right, fine. So then baby mama is at the bowling alley. And what does she do? She calls him up. Can you come and get us? And, because we need a ride. And he doesn't know anything. What does he do? He goes and picks her up, takes her to the apartment. And he wasn't popular with a lot of people because the neighbor, knowing that there's a restraining order, sees him, calls the cops. And to your point, when you said before, there's certain things that you just have to do. You see an injury, as a police officer, this is what you have to do, right? It's your job. And they came to the door. He said, look, we know what's going on here, but we have to do this. So they arrested him. That's just the law, and that's the consequence of what was in place.
So it is an oddity with a temporary restraining order, is that the person who has the restraining order against him or her cannot reach out to the other side. But there is not any restriction on the person who got the restraining order against the other person from reaching out. And so I do think that there should be a mutual restriction, but there isn't in the law.
So it was okay for her, because she got the restraining order on him, to reach out to him.
Sure. But a good attorney, the argument would be, she reached out to him. I understand that there's a violation of the restraining order, but is there really a need for the restraining order? She's certainly not in fear of her safety or welfare. She's asking him to drive her home. The two are inconsistent. So even if you get rid of the restraining order, that case now is going to be heard in the criminal part with regard to the violation. So that would be typically in front of maybe Judge Gauss or another judge that's going to hear the criminal violation.
And that's interesting that you mentioned that again. You mentioned it before, that this is civil. So if somebody doesn't have the money to hire a lawyer, they can't ask for a public defender.
No, everybody's entitled to an attorney, but you will not have an attorney appointed for you. And that's why it's important for attorneys, for those people that fall in the gaps, to be willing to represent people who do not have significant resources, because the consequence can be so great.
And so even though they don't qualify for a or they can't get a public defender, as in a criminal case, there are ways for them to get an attorney at a lower cost through legal aid. Well, does legal aid do that?
I'm not so sure about legal aid, but I know the Morris Sussex Bar, they
Right.
used to have a reduced
They do.
attorney fee program. I think it was John from our Bori's office. I can't remember his last name.
Les.
Velez, and he's excellent.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure he was the one that put that program together.
Oh, really? Yeah, John's a cool cat. Arbori, we're gonna send him the video.
He's
So,
a competent attorney. There's
yeah,
no doubt about
I
that.
know they're both great. They're both great. Go ahead.
Just to answer the question from earlier, there doesn't seem to be anything specifically through the Legal Aid Society, but there is a representation project through the state of New Jersey for low-income victims of domestic violence. It seeks to fill gaps in legal representation for people in those
Nice.
circumstances.
Research girl. This is what a producer does. Well, this was good.
Well, I
You the
appreciate
man.
you having me down there, and I hope that some of your clients out there, can appreciate what we've discussed today and call you if they have questions.
Well, or call Dave. So it's 93 Main Street, which is funny because I used to be at 93 Spring Street. But what's the number? What's your business number again?
We're 93 Main Street. I call it the McNally Building,
The
but
McNalls.
it's right up next to the Newton Library.
What's your phone number? What's your work phone number?
973-500-3212.
That's right. 500-3212. I love it. We're going to sign off for now, Dave. We got a lot of video editing to do because you've provided so much information. And then we're going to we're still going to talk about DUIs.
Oh yeah, we could do that next time.
We got to do that next time. And then any other topics? There's tons of stuff. You're just a wealth of information. All right, signing off. Thanks, Dave.
All right, thank you guys.